Alright, YouTube, I was asked by several people to sort of justify my opinion that a nuclear war is probably going to happen at some point in humanity's near future. Probably within our lifetimes. I hate to sound doom and gloom. I hate to sound like, I'm raining on everyone's parade. But it's still listed as the number one threat to humanity for a reason, and I think there are several reasons that people haven't really considered. Human nature, certain logical scenarios, things of that nature. The most important thing, however, that I use to determine that it's more likely than not going to happen in our future, not necessarily, in the next 5 years or something like that, but in the future, and very possibly, very probably in our own lifetimes. The reason that I say this is that you simply look at mutually assured destruction and the way that it functions. You can say that something either persists or it does not persist. Do you believe, just ask yourself this, that mutually assured destruction will persist forever? And that at no point in human history's future will there either be a total disarmament or a situation in which one side gets the upper hand? The answer, I believe, is that will happen in the future. Mutually assured destruction at some point in human history in the future will break down. I'll tell you why. This is, by the way, even ignoring various Cold War era, we're still in the Cold War, by the way, mistakes that were made, like, the government accidentally dropping a 3-megaton nuclear warhead on North Carolina, which thankfully didn't go off. Various other things that happened on both sides, actually. The Russians and Dell Stage sucks. Yeah, I'm sure I want to cancel. Various things on both sides have happened. Near nuclear disasters. Just look at nuclear power in Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and see how unstable these materials can be. Because they are. So let's overlook, terrorists and hackers and accidents for now. If mutually assured destruction breaks down, the idea is that one side, the United States or Russia being the most likely, the United States being the most likely of all, will have developed technology that will allow it to avoid the possibility of its enemy launching a second strike should they choose to use their own nuclear weapons. In this case, mutually assured destruction has largely prevented nuclear powers from going head-to-head. There might be a minor skirmish, an incident or two, a jet gets downed, there's a border skirmish, something like that, but largely they leave each other alone and fight through proxy states that are not armed with nuclear weapons. Chemical weapons, yeah, maybe, like Syria or something like that, but usually, no, they don't have nuclear weapons. One example where this appears not to be the case is the Korean Peninsula. Of course, North Korea is a Chinese satellite state, a puppet essentially. It does have a few crude nuclear weapons. It's not clear they could actually use them at any effect without destroying themselves in the process, but they're there. They fight through proxy states. Why? Because under mutually assured destruction, if Russia and the United States were to start lobbing non-nuclear weapons at each other, and one side tried to invade the other side would deploy nuclear weapons. They're not going to lose, they're not going to capitulate as long as they have that final option. For the protection of their existence, they would rather destroy the other side utterly and in turn be destroyed nearly utterly, than be destroyed and not destroy the other side at all. I believe that there is a geographic reason why Russia will eventually lose mutually assured destruction. And that is this, and it's quite simple. The United States is sandwiched between two states. Mexico, which doesn't have the ability to oppose us, and Canada, which is a member of NATO, a strong ally. The Mexicans are also an allied state as well. There's heavy trade going on there, and the ties are getting closer and closer. We can't be surrounded. The United States cannot be surrounded by anti-missile platforms. The Russians would have to get Canada, not just Cuba, but Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean states and some of these other Asian states on their side in order to have a hope of surrounding us with anti-missile batteries. But we can surround Russia easily. In fact, we already have. There are about 3 states left on their border that aren't U.S. allies. The Chinese are a trading partner of the West, but they're not going to host our platforms. some of these Eastern European and Middle Eastern states, the Iranians and so forth. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Pakistan, sometimes India, depending on who happens to be in power. The EU, some of the Turks. Turkey is a good example. Egypt, to a lesser extent, as well. I mean, Russia is surrounded because it has a lot of neighbors. It's in Asia. It's not in North America. So I think that's why they will be the losing side to come. The United States, I believe, will eventually develop systems, probably laser systems, which they've already been talking about, maybe a railgun of some sort or an orbital strike, capable of destroying the enemy's nuclear weapons before they leave their own territory. At that point, mutually assured destruction breaks down entirely, because the other side is no longer capable of actually doing anything. Now, here's the problem. It really doesn't matter what the Russians do after that, as long as one side plays the aggressor. And there are four possibilities. Neither side's the aggressor, just Russia's the aggressor, just the US is the aggressor, or both are aggressors. In 3 of those 4 scenarios, the world ends in nuclear fire. Because even if the Russians launch their weapons and we've already surrounded them and down every missile, the amount of radiation released, the amount of ash released, will cause a nuclear winter and cause all of man's society to collapse for a good year. So it would no longer matter. As long as somebody launches a nuclear weapon upon that happening, upon mutually assured destruction breaking down, it doesn't matter who did the launching, or if they both did. The world still ends. There are too many nuclear missiles on both sides for that to be feasible. The United States is more likely to get into it with China than with Russia, simply for that reason. However, again, there's another thing at play here. And this is why I think it's virtually inevitable that there will be a nuclear war in the future. Unless there's a severe balkanization of these Eastern powers or of the US. Unless one of these countries, or one or more of them, breaks down entirely, mutually assured destruction will eventually break down. And it takes the form, there's a common logical riddle, which talks about 2 prisoners which are being questioned separately. And they're both asked to basically rat out this other prisoner. The best possible scenario for both of them is to say nothing. Because in most variants of this riddle, I've heard a dozen different variants. In most versions, if neither of them says anything, they're either let go of scot-free or they get a slap on the wrist punishment. I think it was, in the one I heard, I think it was they get a month in jail. If they both rat one another out, then they both get a bigger punishment. They get a year in jail or something like that. If only one rats the other out, then the one that did the ratting goes free or gets a very small sentence, and the one that got ratted out on is the one that spends the rest of their life in jail. The best possible scenario in this case is that neither of them becomes aggressive. Neither of them challenges the other. Neither of them does harm to the other. As long as they are at peace with one another separately, not necessarily knowing what the other side will do, then they don't get punished, or only very slightly. However, the human tendency in a situation where the risk of being peaceable is so great, when it's gauged to be very high, the natural human tendency is automatically to snap right to aggressor, to become threatening, to do harm to the other side, because the risk of not doing so is too high and too intolerable. In the case of nuclear warfare, where you have a world which is largely split between the US and Russia and several other nuclear states sort of aligned on those same terms, the British and the French are on the side of the US, along with the Germans and Turks, which host missile batteries. The Russians have, to a lesser extent, they have China, which also plays neutral party, sometimes India. Pakistan's, nobody really knows where their loyalties lie. North Korea doesn't really matter in this equation, and neither do the Israelis or Saudis that supposedly have nukes as well. If mutually assured destruction breaks down at some point in the future, one side or the other develops technology allowing them to avoid second strike, and they intend to implement it. They intend to put it into force. Then the tendency will be for the other side to attack. And that's why I believe that there will eventually be a nuclear war in our future. Because unfortunately, if we were to deploy such systems, or the Russians did, or the Chinese did, everyone else would attack them. Because nobody would want them to gain the upper hand and gain such complete dominance that it becomes pointless for them even to have a state in a way, because they no longer have the possibility in the future of fighting back. The only other ways I can see this ending, other than one side developing the ability to remove the other side's second strike ability, would be something like an EMP, or a natural event, like the Carrington event, that simply knocks out the whole world, making us basically dirt-poor potato farmers again. Human beings may not exist forever. We might get wiped out off the face of this earth by pure coincidence. We could have a nuclear war in a week, and then Yellowstone erupts, and then at the same time a 2-mile wide meteor slams into the Indian Ocean. Have a sort of triple threat going on. That could happen, just by chance at some point, just because it hasn't happened yet, and life hasn't been knocked back to the bacterial level before, at least since the Cambrian period. Just because it hasn't happened in hundreds of million years does not mean it can't happen again, unless you think we're cosmically important. All signs point to we're not. We're expendable. We're, one halfway decently civilized race of human beings inhabiting a whirling rock in a piece of the universe that probably no other intelligent life form cares about. Just put that in your pipe and smoke it. So, I believe that in the future, mankind will probably wipe himself out. When I say that, I mean most of the population of the world will be completely vaporized. There'll be survivors. They might be genetically fucked up. They might be mutants. They might get cancer in their 30s, but they'll still be there. A million years later, man may have rebounded, only to build those same weapons again and have the goddamn same situation going on. But I predict that at some point in the future, maybe in our lifetimes, maybe not, because of human nature and because of the competition in technology that is going on a military level, it's going to go kaboom. And it will knock back multiple civilizations. The Southern Hemisphere, I think at the moment, might actually be lucky. We might actually see a time in humanity's future when Australia becomes the world's superpower. Because they've got the technology already. They could make nuclear weapons, by the way, fairly easily. Because the Southern Hemisphere doesn't really have nuclear weapons. There's a small chunk of India that hovers below the equator, I believe, if I remember correctly. All the other nuclear states are in the Northern Hemisphere, and there's less exchange between the atmospheres of the North and South. And so the radiation level down there would be substantially less, potentially. Much of it would have been absorbed by the ocean and watered into the soil. By the time it gets down that low, the oceans would be fucked. You wouldn't be eating much fish unless you wanted to grow gills yourself. But the Southern Hemisphere would be where it's at. They would do a lot better than the North, specifically the Southern Hemisphere near the tropics, because the impending nuclear winter would lower the temperature of the planet quite drastically. So people in the tropics would still be able to grow food. People in northern Australia would probably be fine along the rainforest region. It would wipe out a lot of life on this planet, and it would mutate much of the rest of that life beyond comprehension. You'd see all sorts of probably see weird diseases arising. I've often thought that it's possible that the radioactivity released by nuclear testing during the Cold War, which again we're still in, has caused a higher mutation rate among viruses and bacteria. It's quite simple. It does cause mutations. It is capable of mutating bacterial organisms. There's no reason to believe that it wouldn't. But unfortunately, I see a bleak future for mankind. The only opportunity man has to avert this is, regardless of whether mutually assured destruction breaks down, these sides, either the people or the governments, realize how bad it's getting, how close they are to depopulation, and they do something about it. And they say, this is insane. Are we, God's madmen, so to speak? and then they disarm these weapons. Unfortunately, the likelihood of that happening is also fairly low because, again, you've got these uncooperative groups around the world who want nuclear weapons or who already have them, like the North Koreans. The North Koreans would nuke China. They wouldn't care. They wouldn't care if they nuked Beijing. They're insane. Or at least their government is. No, it's a bleak future for mankind. That's what is probably in our future, is a mushroom cloud. People used to understand this fact. There used to be some outcry over the number of nuclear weapons that were in this world. When they were being built, people said, my goodness, everyone in my family will die. Some people fled the cities. People were building their own bunkers. People were building prefab fallout shelters. They started putting fallout shelters in the post offices. I can remember in the town that I grew up in the early 90s, there was still a sign on the post office that said fallout shelter. They have a fallout shelter underneath the Woodstock post office. These were built deliberately for this purpose. A lot of older buildings have fallout shelters under them. Or they have some sort of potential radiation shielding. I don't want to get bitten by a mosquito and get chikungunya. That's another goodie that's come to the United States from foreign lands through mosquitoes. No, I think that unfortunately the likelihood is above 50% that in the next, let's say, 100 years or so, that one side will break mad and then all hell will break loose. It would take a lot of wrangling, I think, to convince the other side that doesn't have that technology not to press the little red button. What's to hold them back? In their minds, there is a grave risk to their very existence. In their minds, they are likely to be attacked, so it doesn't matter. If you can consider the US benevolent or the Russians benevolent, it wouldn't matter which side develops it and how benevolent they are. What it's up to is the other side under severe stress, knowing that they're going to lose, potentially, their ability to fight back in a nuclear exchange. Will they press the button before the systems are deployed? Of course they will. I'm willing to bet that that's exactly how mankind will end its miserable existence. Because the other side that is falling behind will be too afraid. They are scared. It would terrify people in this country if the Russians began deploying an anti-missile system capable of taking out our ICBMs. It would terrify people in Russia if we developed such a system. And we're developing one right now. We're developing the rudiments of such a system as we speak. That's why I say that I think, unfortunately, the possibilities, the jig is almost up for the human race. You've got to understand, the only thing that can prevent that from happening is these nuclear powers getting into a solid agreement that such systems should be deployed unilaterally so nobody can nuke each other and have it be a success. And then there's another problem. What if they do? What if they all share and share alike and say, kumbaya, let's just get along and get a bong, potentially, if they're meeting in Colorado? What happens then? Post-mutually assured destruction. Nuclear weapons are no longer a viable option. Do you think that humans are going to stop fighting over resources? By then, the population of the world will be even higher. They're going to keep fighting over resources. There will still be proxy wars. There will still be militants. There will still be separatists. That's the other problem. Without mutually assured destruction, they're free to attack one another anyway. And then, what if an industrialized, powerful nation decides to do so? And they take over the world and become authoritarian. Or they try to take over the world and they get butchered. You can still see billions of people die in regular warfare without any WMDs deployed at all. And then what happens then? Do they deploy biological agents? The CDC just found out that in a low-tech, unguarded lab, there was live variola, live smallpox, sitting in unrefrigerated vials in the back of a closet in a cardboard box. They were able to culture live smallpox from these vials. What would have happened if an earthquake had hit and those vials had smashed and, someone ends up face down, they're like, oh, I don't know what happened, but I'm going home. And then all of a sudden they get the pox. What would have happened? 30% lethality or somewhere around there. Oh, well, sorry, a third of the world's population just died. What about Ebola or an influenza strain like the Spanish flu? These viruses they're already working on weaponizing them. What about chemical agents? Chemical bomb will potentially depopulate many city blocks if it's large enough. What about thermobaric explosives? What about the potential of laser weapons? What about EMPs? All of these horrible things that man has designed. I think eventually, given enough time, the odds of this going off kilter and resulting in a mass kill-off approaches 1. I think that the chance approaches 100% that will happen given enough time. If you think on a timescale of infinity, the likelihood of anything that's possible approaches 1. The likelihood of a nuclear war, the likelihood we'll get hit by a massive meteor. Oddly enough, those same nuclear weapons could potentially save our planet if the meteor happens first, because we could potentially blow it out of the air, change its trajectory a little. Oh, it hit the moon. That's going to fuck up our tides, but at least it didn't hit Earth. So yeah, unfortunately, I think if you look at it logically and you simply ask yourself, is mutually assured destruction going to last forever? And even if it does, what about, terrorists get a hold of an atomic bomb or something, and the whole world has a chaotic meltdown as a result of it? What do you think happens? Someone plays agent provocateur and gets a hold of one of these missiles, launches it from Russia into the US, or from the US into Russia, and sparks a nuclear war. Someone who's just terribly nihilistic and psychopathic and really does honestly hate mankind and wants to see it burn. Or what if someone like that gets into office and just says, ooh, finally, I can play around with these little buttons and watch people burn? What if that happens? You think it can't? There have been psychopaths, and look at Pol Pot. There have been people in power before who, if they had had nuclear weapons, would gladly have used them. And they would have done it largely for their own entertainment. They do lurk among us in this world. Not saying that I think that most of the leaders in the world are terribly corrupt. I don't know if any of them are truly psychopaths, but it could happen. I don't see any possible avenue out of mutually assured destruction without destruction. Like I said, even if the nations willingly disarm, they will continue to fight, they will continue to butcher one another, and it'll just make it even more protracted because they won't be wiping each other out in one fell swoop. They'll just bomb each other for weeks or months, potentially years, maybe decades. All hell would break loose. All hell may break loose no matter what the human race does, simply because we made the mistake of splitting the atom. So, that's my take on it. That's about all. Peace out.